Okay, my guest is Jim Rothstein. He's a former New York police detective who has worked hard over his life to try to understand what he calls the biggest terrorist problem in our country, and that's the kidnapping of our children. Many of these kids that you see on milk cartons, their pictures on milk cartons, go into these pedophile rings. Jim has documented it, and one of the things he talks about is that none of these investigations in the 30 or 40 years he's been working on this, both publicly and privately, have ever gone to the very top. When you talk about the very top, he means high-level government officials who are protected, as well as high-level Vatican officials who are protected, i.e. a former late Cardinal Spellman, who Jim investigated, who was the head of the Archdiocese in New York. And we talked about that in past shows. But I first wanted to get Jim's comments regarding, I've never asked Jim these questions regarding state agencies like Children and Family Services. We see that a lot of abuse goes on there, Jim. Kids are being, if they're not being taken off the street by kidnappings like you're talking about, they're being somehow corralled into these agencies and then put into foster cares when you find that there's really no abuse in families. Were you ever working on it? Were you ever aware of any problems with Children and Family Services while you were working as a police officer or after?
Yes, we did. Well, during the time I was a police officer, we had a big thing going between Illinois and Texas, and these kids would end up in foster care, and it was a couple hundred of them ended up shipped down to Texas to some social services network there, and they were funneled into the pedophile world. We also had at another instance where in Minnesota they had one where when the kids that were in foster care and stuff ended up in these homes, they had one in a place called Sauk Center, a girls' home, and we actually had that they were selling the kids to the pimps to be brought into prostitution around the United States, especially New York City. And I have many, many calls where it seems like there's a manual written on how this works. They get into divorce court or somehow get to where they can grab the kids, and then the kids end up into all kinds of different networks. Some of the people are legitimate, but there's a lot of corruption in that, where people have no clue what they're doing, are taking kids and just sending them to homes that are no better, or in most cases worse than where they came from.
Exactly. And what I wanted to emphasize for the next few minutes is this growing problem in all these child services organizations in each state. And what the real problem began when laws were passed that gave financial incentives to states from the feds based on how many children were in their system. So what they started to do, when you see this pattern, is that they began to just corral as many kids as they can and then trump up abuse charges, fraudulent documents, people lying about what the situation was with the families, just to get kids into their system so that they could keep the system functioning, get more federal money, and then in the case you're talking about, a lot of these kids either end up in abusive foster homes or are funneled into these pedophile rings. Did you ever see, when you were, or since you left the police department, do you see a concerted effort to keep these systems running like this all around the states? And how come people can't stop what's going on with these laws that have been passed that are very wrong?
Well, the people that pass these laws, a lot of them have ulterior motives, and those that don't haven't got a clue what's happening. And people shouldn't allow this. I mean, we should stand up for what's right. And you'll find it's awful hard for people to stand up. Many times they are threatened and, that they're going to go to jail for not taking care of their kids and that. But the most important thing to look here is follow the money. Where is the money going? It just goes on and on. The more money they make, the more they got, and they don't really care what happens to the kids in many cases.
Right. And I just see stories of abuse all over the country in these systems, people calling, talking on my show regarding how kids were taken away for a simple dog bite, how kids were taken away because one parent argued with another child. In the case of, and these state agencies can just walk in basically and take these kids. Now, where they end up is another story. Some I've documented have been abused in these foster homes, some even killed, and others somehow are missing and not on the state rolls. In Florida, it was documented by a group there that thousands of children have not been accounted for over the years. They don't know where they're at.
Well, that's
so
why
I assume they end up in the pedophile rings that you investigate.
Yes, a lot of them do, and I think it would be nice if somebody had the courage to inventory this and do an accounting of each and every child that's ever been in the system and see where they are. I think you'd have one of the biggest scandals in this world. Years ago, they'd just throw them in a foster home of some kind under the guise of an orphanage, and they would, if they were lucky, they survived. And some of probably the worst people I dealt with were victims, and then themselves became the pedophiles and stuff that worked on it that came out of these. And now you've got these kids thrown out, seized by people who have no clue what they're doing, overzealous people who shouldn't even be in the business, and they take these kids, and these kids disappear. Who's watching over that? Nobody. And if you bring it up, you're a bad person.
Yeah, exactly. Now, you've called the biggest terrorist threat in this country not what went on after 9/11, but the kidnapping of our children into these pedophile rings. You've dedicated your life to this. As a police officer, you first started out in Vice in New York, and then you worked your way up as detective. Then you got on the State Crime Task Force to try to eliminate this problem. But tell us why you consider this to be the biggest terrorist threat in our country, even to this day.
Well, that's not hard to figure out. You know, you've got these kids disappearing and dying. It covers quite a different variety of things. And you never, you hear this thing, they're investigating the local authorities, the federal authorities, and then the classic comment, we can't talk about it, it's an ongoing investigation. And people start believing this. And I think I've said this on every show I've ever done with you. The only mother I know that's ever stood up and fought him to the end was Noreen Gosh. She just didn't believe that. She wanted to see what was being done, and when she saw nothing was being done, she understood how the system worked. And it's a classic case. I always refer to her case because of how it worked. And this goes on more and more every day. And any police officer or federal agent who dares investigate these cases to the fullest extent of the law, his career is over with. And what really amazes me why it's terrorism is that people are scared to go ahead and want to know what happened to their kid all across this country. And it's growing and growing and growing, and nothing is being done. Although I've
And welcome to the Wednesday, January 7th, 2009 edition of the Investigative Journal. I'm your host, Greg Szymanski, and my guest today is Jim Ross. Jim was a former police detective in New York who uncovered sensitive information that Cardinal Spellman, along with high-level officials in the New York state and federal government, were involved in the pedophilia rings that were running rampant in America and still are today. And for his valiant work, Jim was given an ultimatum: either you leave the department or we'll kill you. Was basically what happened. He left the department finally, but still researches and works together with a number of parents in this country who are losing their children. One, Johnny Gosh, Jim's tried to help Noreen Gosh get her son back, who's in this pedophilia ring. I know you, after you left the department or forced out of the department by high-level officials who wanted no part of this information and wanted to cover it up for their bosses, you started helping Noreen Gosh, a woman who lost her son to this pedophilia ring, as a private citizen. To update that story, just tell us what happened, why it's common still today and it's covered up, and why there's never been an investigation to the top levels of any of these children that we see on milk cartons every day you go into the grocery store. Go ahead.
Well, this is something that's been going on. I first became aware of it in 1968, and over the years we did many investigations, and when it gets to a certain level in our society and government, these cases are shut down. And in the Johnny Gosch case in particular, the cover-up started long before the kidnapping ever happened. And it was a kidnapping that was done. There was a customer who wanted newspaper boys, and Johnny Gosch was a newspaper boy, and he was the first of 4 boys that were kidnapped who were newspaper boys. The one was Jacob Wetterling, who wasn't a newspaper boy, but the guy that was the newspaper kid in St. Joseph, Minnesota, slipped out of his coat and escaped the abductors, and so the secondary target was Jacob Wetterling, and they grabbed him. And it's nice that I'm on the air with you today, because we just had a big break in the case, and naturally it's being covered up by local law enforcement. It's on the websites right now. It's coming out that a man by the name of Vernon Seitz died in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I personally interviewed Vernon Seitz a number of times, and the information he gave me directly ties to the Wetterling kidnapping, but already the disinformation has started, and they're trying to discredit whatever he said. And the Milwaukee police found child porn on his computers and all kinds of stuff that the local authorities are saying, that's all make-up stuff. So you can see that this hasn't stopped to this day yet, that this is it's just hitting the Internet now.
Right, and you even said that the problem today is worse than it was back when Johnny was kidnapped back in the 80s. Just go over how they abducted him and how the story, how they kept him into their web of pedophilia, and how they tried to sway Noreen Gosch from ever really getting to the truth. Tell us a little bit. Just give us a background on this story again.
Well, this young man was targeted because, like I said, they had a customer for a newspaper boy. How that works is you've got customers out there that they're pedophiles who want a certain type of kid. And once they zero in on it, then the kid is taken. And once Johnny Gosch was grabbed, the cover-up started immediately by the local authorities. They tried to discredit Noreen and harassed her, and at one point when the FBI came to her and tried to tell her what they would do and all this stuff, Noreen understood they were trying to con her, and she took a hot cup of coffee and threw the cup and everything right in the agent's face and told him to quit bullshitting her. And that's what happened there. And that case, to this day, every once in a while we'll get new information. And I've met with the present, or he was 2 years ago, the officer still assigned to the case. And it's common knowledge that they will never, ever investigate that case. And
so he was abducted when he was about 11 or 12, right?
Yes, 12 years old.
And then instead, Noreen, there was solid evidence at the time, and this is what is an interesting part of the story that needs to be told again. There was solid evidence at the time from a number of eyewitnesses that he was abducted. However, the police gave them the local police gave the abductors a 48-hour window to escape, based on the fact that they wouldn't listen to this and said he was a runaway, correct?
Yes, and then not only that is when the Martin boy was kidnapped, they were told that this boy was going to be kidnapped and everything, and they didn't do anything, and the guy was kidnapped and has never been seen again. So you know this is an organized operation, and you've heard me say before that we talk about terrorism in our country. The biggest terrorism we have in the United States right now is the abuse and kidnapping of our children and the failure of the police to investigate.
What is the reason? Are they just told from the top to just let go of this story, and they just follow along, or how does that work? Do you think? Because you were a New York cop, you know how it works. How did they go about giving that 48-hour window, which you say is all they need? Because once they have 48 hours, you never find these kids, right?
Yeah, it's about 72 hours.
Okay.
If they have him 72 hours, the kid is gone forever. Once in a while, you'll find a kid that does reappear again for, an hour or two, as in the case of Johnny Gosh. And then when the mother tried to tell the police that, they came up with all kinds of things. Well, why didn't he run to, and you call the cops to that? Well, these kids are controlled in such a way that they know that they can never get back into their normal life. And there's a whole story about how they do that. I personally watched and monitored and interviewed, so we actually saw this happening and how they did it. And it's not very hard to figure out. If you grab a young kid and abuse them and set them up in such a way and tell them the parents sold you and your parents don't want you and all that stuff, the kid is not going to go back to his parents. And I can cite case after case where people who we identified finally where they've been kidnapped years before, and finally, through trusting us, told us their story.
Right, so Johnny Gosh, again, that last question regarding the police. So we have this obvious kidnapping, which occurs in many other cases. Eyewitnesses see Johnny being abducted. He's not a runaway. Why don't the local police really do their job? Are they just listening to their bosses above? How does that work?
Many of them do not understand how this all works, and they write it off for all kinds of excuses. Any police officer, FBI agent, or any other agent of any type in this country who takes on a major pedophile case can kiss his career goodbye, because once you do this and you get to a certain level, and I've been contacted by many police officers, federal agents. In fact, I think on one of your shows I told you where after I retired, a FBI agent was sent to me. He was going to be assigned to the new pedophile squad they had set up, and he came to me to find out how far he could go before his career was in jeopardy. So even to this day, it's a death knell for anybody to investigate these cases if it gets into the upper echelon. And like I said, many